Early 1945. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. The Allied front is still advancing, but the question inside headquarters has shifted. It is no longer whether the armies can move faster. It is what must now take precedence over speed itself. The war has entered a phase where momentum, once the solution to every problem, has begun to create new ones. Patton's Third Army remains capable of rapid movement. Its commanders know how to exploit weakness and push through gaps before resistance can solidify. From the battlefield, speed still appears decisive. Every mile gained feels like progress stolen from the enemy. From Eisenhower's vantage point, that same speed now competes with other obligations. Fuel stocks tighten, supply lines stretch, adjacent armies must adjust their plans to keep pace. Political leaders watch how advances unfold and what they imply about control and balance inside the coalition. Speed, once purely operational, has become strategic. Eisenhower does not question the value of Patton's tempo. He questions whether it can continue to define priorities without undermining the system that sustains the advance. Victory is no longer distant. Its conditions are already being shaped. No order announces a change. No confrontation forces a pause. Instead, priorities begin to form quietly. Decisions about allocation, coordination, and timing signal what now matters more than speed alone. What follows is not the slowing of the war, but the reordering of its purpose. Eisenhower begins to prioritize endurance, balance, and control, knowing that unchecked speed, at this stage, carries costs the Allies can no longer afford. To understand why Eisenhower began to prioritize factors beyond speed, it is necessary to revisit how speed had come to dominate Allied thinking in the first place. In the summer of 1944, the breakout from Normandy transformed the campaign in Western Europe. German defenses collapsed faster than anticipated. Units retreated in disarray. Roads filled with fleeing formations that could not regroup quickly enough to resist sustained pressure. In that environment, rapid movement was not simply effective, it was decisive. Patton's Third Army thrived during this phase. Its rapid exploitation of German weakness across France demonstrated how momentum could substitute for mass and planning. Speed denied the enemy time to organize defenses or coordinate counterattacks. Eisenhower tolerated and often encouraged this approach, because the system could still absorb its consequences. German collapse masked logistical shortfalls. Coordination gaps mattered less when resistance dissolved ahead of advancing forces. By early autumn, those conditions no longer held. The pursuit outran supply. Fuel shortages became persistent rather than temporary. Rail networks destroyed by Allied bombing required extensive repair before they could support sustained operations. Truck convoys stretched hundreds of miles from ports and depots. Eisenhower was forced to choose where limited resources would go, and those choices carried implications far beyond the battlefield. At the same time, the campaign broadened politically. The Allied advance now involved British, American, and French forces operating under a single command, but with distinct national interests. Eisenhower's broad front strategy reflected this reality. Concentrating speed and resources in one sector risked marginalizing others and destabilizing coalition balance. As long as momentum was abundant, these tensions were manageable. As momentum slowed, they intensified. The German Ardennes counteroffensive underscored the danger of overextension. Although ultimately defeated, the attack exposed vulnerabilities created by optimism and assumption. Allied speed had masked coordination gaps and thinly held sectors. Eisenhower absorbed the lesson at the theater level. Speed without structural support invited risk that could not be localized. Political considerations further constrained freedom of action. By late 1944, Allied governments were planning occupation and post-war administration even as fighting continued. Which armies entered which regions, under what authority, and in what sequence mattered. Rapid, uncoordinated advances risked creating political facts on the ground that complicated agreed frameworks. Eisenhower could not afford success that undermined legitimacy. Patton's speed now operated inside this tightening environment. From the front, constraints appeared artificial. Enemy resistance still seemed uneven. Opportunities appeared briefly and vanished. To Patton, delay remained the enemy. His logic was consistent with earlier success. Move faster than the opposition can react. Eisenhower's responsibility was different. He had to ensure that speed did not dictate priorities by default. Every rapid advance now required fuel that had to be denied elsewhere. Every shift in tempo affected adjacent armies and political perception. Speed, once the organizing principle of success, had become one variable among many. German command adapted accordingly. As Allied advances became more deliberate and synchronized, German planning shifted toward delay and preservation. When Allied speed appeared unchecked, opportunities for exploitation increased. Eisenhower recognized that regulating tempo reduced not only Allied risk, but enemy leverage. This context explains why Eisenhower's priorities changed without fanfare. There was no single order declaring speed subordinate. Instead, the system through which speed operated was adjusted. Allocation, coordination, and sustainment began to outweigh tempo alone. By early 1945, Eisenhower faced a reality shaped by success. The question was no longer how quickly ground could be taken, but whether the advance could be sustained politically, logistically, and strategically. What Eisenhower chose to prioritize would determine not just how fast the Allies moved, but how securely victory would be achieved. From Patton's perspective, speed remained the most reliable answer to uncertainty. His experience suggested that German resistance, when pressed continuously, lost coherence faster than it could recover it. Momentum simplified the battlefield. It reduced the need for complex coordination and denied the enemy time to exploit Allied hesitation. To Patton, slowing down introduced risk rather than reducing it. Eisenhower's perspective was shaped by a different calculus. As Supreme Allied Commander, he evaluated speed not by its immediate gains, but by its cumulative effects. A rapid advance altered fuel priorities, redirected air support, and forced neighboring armies to adapt their plans in response rather than in concert. Eisenhower understood that speed, when allowed to dominate decision-making, could begin to govern the system instead of serving it. Subordinate commanders felt this shift most acutely. Corps and division staffs prepared plans that still emphasized initiative, yet approval increasingly depended on alignment rather than opportunity. Speed was no longer sufficient justification on its own. Commanders learned to present operations in terms of sustainability, coordination, and political acceptability. Initiative survived, but it was framed more carefully. Allied political leadership viewed speed through the lens of balance and legitimacy. British leaders remained sensitive to perceptions of American dominance on the continent. French authorities monitored how liberation translated into control within their territory. For them, unchecked speed carried implications about authority and post-war influence. Eisenhower absorbed these concerns as part of his role, adjusting priorities before tensions surfaced publicly. The human dimension reinforced Eisenhower's caution. Rapid advances placed Allied troops in continuous contact with civilian populations emerging from occupation. Discipline, conduct, and symbolism carried political meaning. Incidents that occurred under conditions of speed could escalate quickly, drawing attention away from military success and toward questions of control. The German command interpreted Allied priorities opportunistically. When speed appeared to outpace coordination, German planners searched for vulnerabilities, overextended supply lines, thinly held sectors, or opportunities to portray the Allies as disorganized. As Allied advances became more deliberate and synchronized, those opportunities diminished. German planning shifted toward delay rather than disruption. Each of these perspectives reflected rational priorities shaped by responsibility. Patton sought decisive collapse. Eisenhower sought endurance and cohesion. Subordinate commanders sought clarity. Political leaders sought balance. German command sought leverage. Speed intersected with all of them, but it did not satisfy all of them equally. What emerged was not a disagreement over objectives, but a divergence over means. Speed remained valuable, yet it no longer stood alone as the measure of success. Eisenhower's priorities began to reflect the demands of sustaining victory rather than achieving it. As these perspectives converged, the moment approached when speed would have to yield to other considerations. The campaign had reached a stage where prioritization itself became the decisive act. The point at which Eisenhower's priorities overtook Patton's speed did not arrive as a sudden intervention. It emerged as a convergence of pressures that could no longer be managed through informal adjustment. By early 1945, the Allied advance had reached a stage where speed alone could no longer be allowed to determine outcomes. Eisenhower understood that if momentum continued to dictate priorities, the system supporting it would begin to fracture. Fuel distribution would remain reactive. Air support would be reassigned on short notice. Adjacent armies would be forced to reshape plans around movement they had not coordinated. These were not temporary inconveniences. They were structural vulnerabilities that expanded with every rapid advance. The lessons of the previous months reinforced this conclusion. The September logistics crisis demonstrated how quickly supply could become the limiting factor of success. The Ardennes counteroffensive revealed how gaps created by overconfidence could be exploited at scale. Together, they showed that speed without governance increased risk rather than reduced it. Eisenhower's response took form through prioritization rather than prohibition. He did not order Patton to slow down. Instead, he ensured that speed no longer automatically outranked other requirements. Allocation decisions began to favor sustainment over exploitation. Operational boundaries were clarified and enforced to preserve coordination. Approval processes became more explicit, requiring that advances align with theater-wide intent. For Patton, the change was evident in how momentum translated into action. Advances continued, but they no longer expanded authority by default. Proposals were evaluated not only on opportunity, but on impact. Speed remained a tool, but it no longer defined priorities on its own terms. This shift marked the turning point. Once Eisenhower concluded that speed could no longer serve as the organizing principle of the campaign, alternatives disappeared. He could not revert to earlier latitude without reintroducing risks the coalition could not absorb. Nor could he publicly curtail a successful commander without undermining unity. Structural prioritization offered the only viable path. German command detected the change in rhythm. Allied pressure remained constant, but its character altered. Rapid thrusts were embedded within coordinated movements. Opportunities created by imbalance became rarer. German planning increasingly focused on delay rather than disruption, as the Allied system grew more predictable and resilient. At the coalition level, Eisenhower's prioritization reassured partners. British and French leadership saw confirmation that American speed would not override collective control. Decisions reflected shared intent rather than individual tempo. Authority remained centralized, visible, and deliberate. The climax, therefore, was not a confrontation between commanders. It was Eisenhower's decision to ensure that speed served sustainment, legitimacy, and cohesion rather than competing with them. From that moment on, Patton's momentum continued, but it operated within a hierarchy of priorities that Eisenhower had clearly defined. Once this reordering took hold, the campaign moved forward under a new equilibrium. Speed was preserved, but it was no longer sovereign. The war entered its final phase guided by priorities that extended beyond the battlefield, carrying momentum toward conclusion without allowing it to undermine the system that sustained it. And the consequences of Eisenhower's prioritization were felt less in the pace of individual advances than in the stability of the campaign as a whole. Speed did not disappear, but it no longer set the agenda. What followed was a shift from momentum-driven action to system-driven progress. For Patton's Third Army, the most immediate change was how success translated into authority. Rapid movement no longer guaranteed priority in fuel, air support, or follow-on resources. Advances continued, but they were increasingly synchronized with neighboring armies and logistical planning. Patton retained operational initiative, yet that initiative now operated within limits that reflected theater-wide needs rather than local opportunity. Eisenhower absorbed the political and coalition pressure that this shift was designed to manage. His Allied leaders directed concerns upward toward SHAEF, rather than toward individual commanders. By centralizing responsibility, Eisenhower insulated field commanders from diplomatic friction while ensuring that no single army appeared to dominate the campaign. This buffering role preserved both cohesion and effectiveness. At the alliance level, the effects were stabilizing. British and French leadership saw evidence that American speed would not override collective decision-making. Resource allocation appeared more balanced. Operations unfolded with fewer abrupt changes that required political explanation. As planning for occupation and post-war administration accelerated, this predictability became increasingly important. Logistical reliability improved. Supply lines aligned more closely with planned movements rather than reactive exploitation. Fuel shortages remained a constraint, but their impact became more predictable and manageable. Air support and artillery coordination benefited from clearer boundaries and schedules. While some opportunities were delayed, fewer operations stalled due to overextension. German command experienced the change indirectly. Allied pressure remained relentless, but opportunities created by imbalance diminished. Attempts to exploit stretched sectors or logistical gaps produced fewer results. German defensive planning increasingly focused on delay rather than disruption, as the Allied system became harder to destabilize. Strategically, Eisenhower's prioritization reduced volatility. Progress continued at a slightly more deliberate pace in places, but it became harder to interrupt. Territory gained was held. Supply caught up. Political legitimacy was preserved alongside military success. What Eisenhower accepted was not diminished authority, but expanded responsibility. He chose to prioritize endurance, cohesion, and legitimacy over speed alone. In doing so, he ensured that Patton's momentum served the alliance rather than challenged it. By the time Allied forces approached the final operations inside Germany, the consequences of this choice were clear. The campaign advanced as a coordinated pressure rather than a race, guided by priorities designed to carry victory to a stable conclusion. This moment endures because it exposes a quiet truth about command that only becomes visible near victory. Speed, so powerful in moments of collapse and pursuit, Cheetah cannot remain the supreme priority once success begins to generate responsibility. What Eisenhower ultimately prioritized over Patton's speed was not caution, but sustainability. Patton's tempo had delivered results when uncertainty dominated the battlefield. Rapid movement denied the enemy time and clarity. Earlier in the campaign, that imbalance favored the Allies. By early 1945, the imbalance had shifted. The closer Allied forces moved toward Germany, the more speed threatened to outrun the political, logistical, and coalition structures required to carry victory forward. Eisenhower's leadership lay in recognizing that transition before it became destructive. He did not reject speed or discredit aggression. He placed them within a hierarchy of needs that reflected the realities of coalition war. Supply, coordination, legitimacy, and unity became priorities, not because speed had failed, but because it had succeeded too well. Historically, this explains why Allied victory in Western Europe was not achieved through maximum tempo alone. It was achieved through controlled pressure applied within systems capable of absorbing its consequences. Eisenhower understood that a war won too fast, without regard for balance and sustainment, risked unraveling at the moment it ended. Patton's advances continued to shape the battlefield. Eisenhower's priorities shaped what those advances meant beyond it. One delivered momentum. The other ensured that momentum did not undermine the alliance that made it possible. The final phase of the war unfolded under that balance. Speed remained decisive, but it no longer dictated outcomes on its own terms. Eisenhower's choice ensured that victory arrived not only quickly, but intact. In the end, what mattered most was not how fast the Allies moved, but how deliberately they chose what speed must serve.